Hi, my name is Erica Almira, and I'll be covering Susan Glaspell's personal life and influences on modern culture. Let's first start off with personal life. Susan Glaspell was born in 1876. She grew up and was raised on a farm near Davenport, Iowa. Her father was a hay farmer and her mother was a school teacher. She had two brothers. Glaspell had an affinity for animals, as she would rescue strays. Her grandma would often tell her stories of her pioneer adventures, which would spark her imagination. She was also inspired by the writing of Black Hawk, a Sauk American Indian chief whose former land she was raised on. Glaspell went to college at Drake University in Des Moines. This was seen as a rebellious act against gender expectations, as many believed it was harder to get married and find a husband if a woman went to college. She was said to have a competitive spirit, having represented the college in a statewide debate competition. She graduated in June 1899. The Des Moines Daily News lauded her as a leader in the social and intellectual life of the university after she graduated. After this was published, she worked as a reporter for the paper. She covered murder cases and politics. This was another male-dominated field, so this was also seen as a rebellious act. She quit her job in 1901 and returned to Davenport to write. While living in Davenport, she became one of the founding members of the Davenport Group of Writers. It was there where she met George Crabbe Cook, whom she married in 1913. Cook had left his job as a literature and writing professor and became a truck farmer, and had divorced his second wife to be with Glaspell. To escape the gossip of their marriage, they moved to New York City's Greenwich Village. They worked toward radical social reform. Glaspell was a feminist and took up suffrage causes. You will hear more about this from my other group mates. Having suffered from several miscarriages and fibroids, Glaspell and her husband moved to Provincetown in 1915 to recover her health. It was there where she and Cook developed a new theater collective called the Provincetown Players. This helped cement her role as a respected playwright. In 1923, after moving to Greece, after her collective was disbanded, Glaspell became a widow as her husband died suddenly from an infection he caught from their dog. She spent the remaining of her years in Provincetown writing fiction. She returned to the U.S. in 1924. She died on 1948. Now let's get into influences in modern culture. Glaspell's themes of womanhood and gender roles in American society in her plays and novels challenge conventions of what could be shown on the theatrical stage. Additionally, her theatrical styles innovated and promoted new experimental styles in drama, which helped shape American theater to this day. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, so today we will talk about Susan Glaspell. Born in 1876, Glaspell was among the first women to pursue higher education and a profession at a time when this was a perceived of men. In this time, women could not participate in jury or even vote. The feminist movement started to rise in the 18th century to equalize women's right to vote, and it was supported by the suffragists, a group of people who fought for women's right to be equal with men. And so that means in the 18th century, feminists struggled for equalize in almost all aspects. In her career, she also had many famous works, such as Suppressed Desire in 1915, Joyful in 1916, Love the Book, The Outside, The People in 1917, and Ellison House in 1930. Books and short story. Published Mass in 1912. Original published in 1912. Lifted Mass is the only collection of short story brought together by Susan Glaspell. Glaspell also convincingly depicts the widening social and economic disparity of the time and urbanization. Her theater company was a critical success. It didn't earn enough to pay the bills, so Glaspell continued to write and sell her short story to make ends meet. A jury of her peers in 1927 were a short story version of her famous late trifle. Judy Rankin Daughter in 1945 was the last night novel of Glaspell. So we will talk about the trifle. Trifle by Susan Glaspell, which include part of what women's suffrage movements were all about. Trifle is essentially a presentation of challenges that women faced in late 19th century and early 20th century. This story integrates the attitude of society at that time concerning women. The social position observed was considered lower than male. This conveys the story of a murder mystery concerning of married couple of Mrs. Wright and her husband, the murder victim John Wright. It was inspired by Susan Glaspell experience as a courtroom reporter during a murder trial in 1900. Who are the characters? So in the story, we have Miss Peter, a related newcomer to the town. Never knew Mrs. Wright before never knew Mrs. Wright before Mr. Wright married her. A slightly wiry woman and understand loneliness and the world of the female domestic. We also have Miss Hell. She felt sorry for Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hell regret not having come to visit Mrs. Wright to alleviate her child's life. We also have Henderson, young and professional in manner. Henry Peter, local sheriff. Lewis Hell, a very descriptive person, had a strong memory and the first person to discover Mrs. Wright's death. We also have other characters like John Wright, a local farmer. He was good, but he also harmed men and neglected his wife's happiness. And Mrs. Wright, man suspect in her husband's murder. And this is the largest for the story.
Hi, my name is Annie Ross, and today I'm going to be talking about Susan Glaspell, her one-act play, Trifles, and the political and philosophical context of those. So the first thing that's important to learn about this is where are we in history? What is the point in political history that Susan lived in? In 1876, Susan Glaspell is born. And then when she's about 40, she writes Trifles. And then in 1948 is when Susan Glaspell dies. The context of that is that in 1848, so before Susan is born, the Seneca Falls Convention is held. This is held by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott in upstate New York. And this is where the Declaration of Sentiments is created. It has demands that the women want to make for additional opportunities. This includes financial independence, and among those things is the right to vote. And then On the other end is in August 1920 is when the 19th Amendment is ratified. Tennessee ultimately becomes the final state needed to ratify the amendment to pass it into law, and white women are awarded the right to vote. Here you can see some suffragists sewing different stars onto the flag to show the different states that have ratified the 19th Amendment. So with that context, it's important for us to see that the women's voting rights movement between 1848 and 1920 is really expanding the majority of Susan Glaspell's life, and that is why it has such a strong influence on her writing. So if we look specifically at the time, 1916, when she writes Trifles, and how we can see that reflective of the times that she lived in. So one of the themes that you can see throughout Trifles, the one-act play, is there are a lot of feminist themes and a reflection on what it means to be a woman during this time period. One of the things that we can review is the patriarchal oppression and how that affects the characters in the play, the concept of women's work, and sisterhood and the liberation of women. So one of the themes is the patriarchy, and as we review Minnie Foster, the main character, what we can see is, although she's not in the play itself, we can see that the other characters discussing about her and how she lived. In fact, most of it has to do with the conversation between the two women in the play and them discussing kind of what life she lived and relating it to theirs. So one of the things that they say about Minnie Foster or Minnie Wright is that, similar to how the house that they live in, that the Wrights live in, is down a path and cut off from the road, that many times women in this era are isolated because they're isolated into their own housework, and they aren't connecting with other women as often. This is a symptom of the patriarchy. The other piece of that is, by being isolated, they also lack identity. There are different pieces, including kind of the next one I'll expand on more, which is the concept of women's work. But the idea that the kitchen and how the kitchen is upheld is a reflection of who Minnie Wright, Minnie Foster was as a person. And so I will go into that a little bit further. So the concept of women's work is kind of the namesake of this story. So the trifles, kind of the unimportant pieces of the house that it was the expectation for the wife to take care of. The men in the beginning, so the county attorney and then the two people investigating, they're looking at kind of how she kept the house, that the kitchen is a little bit dirty. That's a reflection of her character. They're almost looking at it as her failure or assumed failure is a proof that she may be guilty. The women actually discuss this. They say that they think that this is what the men will do. They'll try to make a story about how it was dirty and those sorts of things. In addition, the strawberry preserves, the Mrs. Wright had told the two women that she was most worried about the fact that the preserves had probably exploded, and the men kind of remark that, isn't it silly that a woman is up for murder, and that's the thing that she's worried about. But in fact, that is just a reflection of, those are the things that are most important to her because that's what society told her. And perhaps she already knows that these things that are out of order in her home are going to be the things that she's judged on. So that's a little bit about women's work and the state of the house and how they believe that's a reflection of her character. The last overarching theme that I'll put in here is kind of the sisterhood and the liberation of women. I felt like this was kind of the most important theme throughout, and what we can see is that the men are going around and they're specifically looking for evidence in a maybe a empirical way. They're checking the farm, they're looking at different pieces of the house, looking for clues explicitly. But what the women do is they use their experience in order to kind of discover the evidence. They use empathy and they use their experiences to overlook Minnie Foster's experience. And then at the end, they are connected to a moral dilemma and they do choose rebellion in trying to cover for Minnie Foster, Mrs. Wright. And what I think this represents in terms of the philosophical idea of that time is that Susan Glaspell is trying to speak on the idea that women need to come together, although the situation is isolating. They each have their own experiences, but women can learn from empathy. They are smart enough to put things together. In fact, they're seeing things that perhaps the men are not. And in fact, they need to come together and form sort of a rebellion, and they are capable of doing so. So I think that is what speaks to the time, the political and philosophical inclinations of Susan Glaspell. And that's it. All right, thank you.